Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Edgware United Synagogue for this session of the Heritage Lottery funded project, London Jews in the First World War. We were there too. We have with us tonight the project director, Alan Fell, Louise Scott, assistant project manager, Rachel Fellman and Tara Framp. I'm also pleased to welcome David Jacobs, who until recently served for 6 years as National Chairman of the Jewish Historical Society of England. We are all still influenced by the First World War, the so-called war to end all wars, and since 2014, we have been inundated with centenary events. In our own Edgware community, Lord Turnberg last month discussed inter alia the impact of the First World War on the wording and timing of the Balfour Declaration. Last weekend, we honoured the fallen of 2 world wars at the Cenotaph, and in our own Yiska booklets, we still honour the memory and read out the names of those who made the supreme sacrifice. We use World War I language regularly in our speech without being aware of its origin. If you came here tonight for having a chat, if you expected the refreshments to include plonk, if you think that this session is going over the top, and if you read the bump I distributed, you are using slang from the Great War. In the theatre, on film or on television, many of you will have seen Oh What a Lovely War, All Quiet on the Western Front, Journey's End, Ian Hoslop's Wipers Times and War Horse, and on the domestic front, The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp and Waterloo Bridge. And all these and others will have influenced your perceptions of what the war was like. Tonight, Alan and his team will take us on a journey of London's Jewish population during the Great War, describing aspects of Jewish life in London between 1914 and 1918, and we'll also discuss how you personally can load details of your own ancestors alongside photographs and historical records. After the presentation, the project team will be happy to discuss with you how you can become involved in the project.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm here to ask for your help. It's as simple as that. There's no such thing as a free Danish, so I'm here to ask for your help. What are we doing and why do we need your help? It's very simple. The Jews, us Jews, have got too much history about the Second War. We know all about the Second War. There's too much history for us about that. What we don't know enough about, and what is in danger of being lost, is the First War. We had an enormous contribution to make and did make in that conflict, both on the military side and on the home front, as we now call it. And if you doubt what I'm saying, that this is at risk, 20 minutes ago, a gentleman turned up. He's had to leave for choir practice, and he brought with a book, which was his wife's father, Shalom, and that book was about to be put on a skip when the house was cleared. It is a book which will end up in a museum. We'll have it first, but it will end up in a museum. And that's what we're up against. We need your help to tell us the stories of the First World War. And if you don't have any, that's fine. We'll get them out of you. The doors are now closed. Nobody gets out without a story. So let's first ask the question for which Brian is excluded from answering, and that is, what do we think was the number of Jews who served in the military? Let's take the military in all its possible ramifications and guises. How many Jews do we think served in the First World War? Any guesses? 40,000? 55? 3? Okay, well, it's not exact. We're not exactly sure. But we think about 40 to 50,000 served. Maybe more, maybe 55. If you include what we nowadays call the Commonwealth. Those days, of course, it was the dominions, the colonies, and so on. How many Jews were living in Britain at the time of the outbreak of war? Sorry? 250,000? Okay, the answer is we're not entirely sure. It's an easy answer. 250 is possibly right. Let's say 300. But the important point is not the number of Jews. The important point is the percentage of the population of Jews who volunteered. Many were conscripted. Conscription came in 1916. There was a volunteer army between 14 and 16. Many volunteered. And I'll show you later on a very poignant example of a forced volunteer, if you like. So, as a percentage of the population, of the Jewish population, we made a magnificent and very large contribution. Very few people know about that. Certainly, very few of our young people will know about that. And that is the second part of this project, to make available these stories and the stories of London during the war to our youngsters. And in particular, to be ready for next year. Next year is the centenary of the armistice. And if you think the Olympics had a lot of publicity, you ain't seen nothing yet. The government are going to flood the place with armistice promotion. It is vital that we were there too, the name of our project. The Jewish contribution to armistice is recognized. And we trailed this last Sunday at the Ajax Parade, where in the brochure we made the first of many announcements that Armistice 2018 will be something special. And it will be something special. We're planning something quite spectacular. So it's important that we remember the contribution. And it's also important we remember the contribution in a narrow sense as well as this big sense. One of our strategic partners is the JLGB, now called the JLGB. 100 years ago, it was called the JLB. They had over 500 fatalities in the First World War. Their contribution as an organization was absolutely staggering. And what we've been doing is digging those stories out, getting those stories. So that's by way of an introduction. So, what did we do? What have we been doing? The important point is that this story is so big that we had to go and get public support. And I'm very delighted to say that the Heritage Lottery, Mr. Horowitz knows about it intimately, the Heritage Lottery Fund gave the Jewish community the thick end of £500,000 to tell this Jewish story. So we're here tonight, courtesy of Her Majesty's government, to tell the story and to get your help. So this in no way is a small undertaking, a casual undertaking. It's a very sophisticated undertaking. What we've been doing for the past 2 years is building a website, because apart from anything else, that's nowadays how young people learn. You can give them a book, but instinctively they reach for something digital. So this is a digital history of the Jewish community at that time. That allows us to do several things which would be otherwise impossible. So last week, for example, we released the over 1,200 images of the collection of the Jewish Museum and the Ajax Jewish Military Museum in Camden, and those images are now on the site. So you can go there and see the originals, but you can also look online at the images. You can see already, I hope, the potential for schools and for study and for commemorating the armistice. Fantastic images. We've also been collecting private collections and collections that are in all sorts of places. Undoubtedly, our most famous success was a rumor that we heard about the existence in a synagogue of the Cheder projects of 1915 and 1916 in existence. We, of course, thought that was just not possible and just not credible. Who has Cheder projects for 100 years ago? When I was a Cheder, 6 months was a long time. Okay, we ferreted around, we dug around, we drove around, we went to the wrong shul, etc., etc. We ended up at St. John's Wood Liberal Synagogue, and we said, we've heard this story. And they said, yes, it's true. Would you like to see them? We fall off our chairs, pick ourselves up, and go in, and from underneath the stairs, and I don't exaggerate, from underneath the stairs, my cupboard, they bring out carton boxes, and there is 2 books in absolutely pristine condition of the Cheder projects of this synagogue of 1915 and 1916. Before we arrived in the scene, they'd been shown to the National Archive at Kew, who pronounced them immediately important enough to be put on the official register of National Treasure. Kew maintains the National Register of important British documents. They're now on that register. Later on, a few months later, through the Daily Telegraph, we ran a story about these books. They were shown to the British Library, who immediately said, these documents are of immense historical importance. They are the last surviving anywhere in the world, the last surviving contemporaneous views of Jewish children about the First World War. They're on the site. We took the digitalization, we wrote stories about them, and we uploaded them on the site. About 2 weeks ago, we had an email in from a school in Herne Hill, which is Herne Bay in Kent, not Herne Hill, Herne Bay in Kent, a non-Jewish primary school, who had been on the site, followed the story of a particular Jewish soldier, then went to the Cheder books and did their own art project mimicking what the Cheder children had did 100 years ago. Such is the power of a website and such is the power of a story. So we're anxious to collect these documents. We don't keep the original. We just take digital copies, and I'm going to show you some. So we don't keep the originals, and this gentleman has just brought something. We're going to talk to him as to where he can donate the original to. But the point is that wherever it goes, it will be accessible to everybody. So let me now show you some examples. As I said, we had 2 objectives. To tell the story of London during the First World War period, more or less from 1910 to about 1920 is the period we're looking at, and some earlier stuff, as you'll see, and the personal records of people who were involved. Now, we are very anxious that this is not seen merely as a military site, as a site for soldiers or airmen or Navy personnel, because there's another story, and I'll show you those as well. And that's the story of particularly women staying on the home front, as we nowadays call it. They had 2 roles: try and keep the family together, and many, of course, were involved in war work. If we take the first one, trying to keep the family together, you can imagine the situation 100 years ago. Many of these women didn't speak English. They had just arrived. There was no welfare system. There was no health service. There was no nothing. We came across at Tower Hamlets Library, which is the depository of the records of the exemption tribunals for London. In other words, if you tried to gain exemption from war service, you went to a tribunal, and Tower Hamlets has got their records. We came across the story of a Jewish woman with 13 children, and she was applying for exemption on behalf of her husband, because if he never came back, you can imagine, as we say in Gaelic, och an bheith. He was not granted exemption. We've always wondered what happened. We can't find out. So there's this business of trying to keep everything intact, keep the organization of the family life and of our community intact. Women also volunteered. They were not conscripted, but volunteered for work. And we'll show you, if we have time, the story of one woman. Let me put her in context for you. Who's heard of Dora? Dora? Defence of the Realm Act 1914. Dora's the Defence of the Realm Act 1914. This was the Act of Parliament that allowed the government to shoot you and ask questions afterwards. It was a censorship act as well. We came across one gentleman who told us the story of his grandma. By all accounts, she was a clever girl. She could read and write Yiddish. Most could just speak it, but she could read and write Yiddish. So she was taken into the GPO. Everybody remember the GPO? I'm aging myself. The GPO in Whitechapel as a censor, because the soldiers were told to write the postcards home in English, to which they said, what's the point of doing that? So they wrote the addresses in English, but they wrote the messages in Yiddish. And most of the messages were innocuous. Dear Rebecca, I'll be home soon, keep the cholent warm. But, of course, the War Office didn't think that. The War Office thought, oh my God, they're going to invade any minute. They're a bunch of saboteurs and so on. So her job in the GPO was to translate for the military censors, military intelligence, these postcards that were coming in. We have stories of women, pillion riders, motorbike messengers, stories of nurses. And if we have a story in a moment, we'll tell you the story of an outstanding woman who was buried with full military honours for her nursing devotion. Extraordinary story. So, when I talk about the home front, I'm not just talking about the men or the military side, which is relatively easy for us to get hold of because they're associated with some kind of military record, usually. There are problems with it, by the way, but nevertheless, we're good at now ferreting things out. On the home front, they're much more difficult to get at. So, let me now give you some examples. Should we do Sydney Street? So, let me give you an example. Can we get rid of the bottom bar? Okay, fine. All right. Who's heard of the siege of Sydney Street? Like to tell us about it? Oh, okay. Right, so this is the story of three supposed anarchists who held up a jeweller's shop in Houndsditch, and made off and hid eventually in Sydney Street, and the objective was to capture them alive, and that, of course, didn't happen for very long, and there was an amazing siege, and I'll tell you in a minute the parallel, and this is the story. Now, here on the site, you get three things. You get, in this case, some video footage, which is extremely rare. Comes to us from British Pathé. They say it's one of the first outside broadcasts ever made. You get narrative, so the children can read about the story. We've added the Metropolitan Police record of the events. And we've loaded still photographs, which come to us from a private collection of a man called Adrian Androusier. Amazing collection he has, over 100,000 images of Judaica. And some very rare stuff. So, this is what happens. Let's see if we can see the film, and it doesn't crash on us. And there's the soldiers, the detectives as they called them, the police, the Royal Scots Greys, with their guns and so on. Amazing stuff. When we show this to children, they have automatic reactions. They ask two questions right away. Where's the sound? And why is it not in colour? We try to explain that 1911 was a different era. So there they're arriving. They were summoned from the Tower of London, and they arrive any minute on horseback, and they bring their machine, their Gatling guns, their Maxim guns, they bring everything to get these three guys out of the house they're hiding in. See, who's the gentleman there? Did we recognize him? Winston Churchill, who was then Home Secretary, and through his entire career was never one to miss a public relations opportunity. And he turned up to direct operations. It is said that when the fire brigade wanted to go in to put out the fire, he told them no. So, a lot of emotion in East End. When we asked the kids who had ever heard of Petticoat Lane, there was a blankness descended. What's Petticoat Lane? To people in this room, I think we're all pretty familiar with it. I'm not so familiar with it, it's not my Medina, but I think people are pretty familiar with it. Okay, this is Petticoat Lane. This is very rare. This story, the greatest Sunday market, and this is Petticoat Lane. Look at these guys. There's about 3 women and about 10,000 men. And you can see what's going on. And I'm always interested in the question again, when you look around here, you try to identify people from 1903. Look at it, teeming market. So I want to know, for example, pick any one of them, whose Zayda is that? So here's some of the stuff that's available. Please look at it. Please encourage your children, grandchildren to look at it. You can see Jewish life without this is the St. John's Wood books, really worth looking at. The nursing corps, the Munitions Act, the Royal Navy, Third Battle of Ypres, Passchendaele, Sydney Street, and so on and so on. Simon Militeers. We're adding stuff here at the rate of about 1 a fortnight, roughly now. The next one going up is Belgian refugees. An enormous number of Belgian refugees, the Jewish refugees came, and we have material including the menu of a charity dinner to raise money for them. We were doing charity dinners even then. The one going up after that is the anti-Semitic cartoons of the Punch magazine during the First World War. We bought them from Punch. I'm not sure if Punch quite know what we're going to do with them, but never mind. We're working very closely with the RAF and the RAF Centenary because we want to collect stories of Jews associated with the Royal Flying Corps. We estimate that there were some 230 Jews in the Royal Flying Corps. We have stories from JLB of 19-year-olds being killed in Mesopotamia. I can't say that word, in Mesopotamia, in the Royal Flying Corps. And we have these stories. So there's all these history windows which tells the story. Please look at them. You can also look at the collection of the Jewish Museum, the Jewish Military Museum, all of which is up there for you to see. This gentleman who brought the book in just before he started, by Christmas, his story, or the story of his mother's, his wife's fathers, his father-in-law, his story will be up there, and that book will be up there. It's a priceless book. It's going to be thrown away, can you imagine? So that's it. Now, let's look at the other part of the website. The other part of the website is about collecting stories of individuals. So far, there's about 700 stories up there. By Christmas, we hope there'll be the best part of 1,000. And they are a mixture of maybe 5% the famous, 5% the household names. This is a household name. Does anybody know who this is? This is a lady called Florence Oppenheimer, who served with great distinction as a nurse. Very great distinction. Survived the war. Yes. She then went on to marry the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, which may or may not be the good shidduch, I don't know. But anyway, she became Florence Greenberg. She survived the war, and I'm pretty sure most of you have got one of her books in your kitchen. So this is a lady whose story is amazing because she served with great distinction as a nurse, and is a story which is relatively easy for us to get at because she is such a public figure. It's not very difficult for us to ferret her out. But that's not always the case. So let's take the lady, the nurse, who Rachel and Tara found, who is really quite amazing. This is a lady called Dora Bernstein. I'm going to stand here so you can see, I'll shout. This is the Flowers Wilson Cemetery after her military funeral, with full military honours. She was born in 17th of January 1888, or, and this is what I want to point out to you now, remember please, this is a Jewish website. So the software converts all the civil dates into the Hebrew calendar. So we can, people want, commemorate Yortsites, and we can do this. So the software automatically converts dates into the Hebrew calendar, which gave the web designers, by the way, quite a panic attack. Never mind, we got over it. So she was born in South Africa, and she died in 1918, the 6th of November 1918, the 12th of Kislev, and she died not in combat, but from pneumonia. What did we usually call pneumonia in 1918? The Spanish flu. She was one of these people who was in the Spanish flu. Her testimonials in the paper, she served the South African Military Nursing Service, she was a staff sister, she served in Salonika, Egypt, France, everywhere she served. This is her obituary in the Jewish Chronicle. This is her place in the Roll of Honor. This is where she is in the Commonwealth Graves Commission. What people don't know is that Wilson Cemetery has a part of it which is official Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery. So she's buried there with enormous honour. This is a lady who is difficult to get at. Not because she's not known, because she was in her day very well known, but not now. And it's very important we don't lose her story. And you can see again, to repeat myself, you can see the educational value when people want to do things, as schools, projects, or whatever, to take somebody like that and say, what was it like being a young Jewish girl in 1880, born in 1888? And within about 15 years, 18 years, was already committed to being a nurse in the most terrible circumstances, in the most terrible theatres of war, and how she then was taken by the Spanish flu. Let's take another one. Let's take Jasper. What? Oh, who's that? Right, okay. Should we do that one? JLB boy. Okay, good. Okay, this is Pampel. Pampel. Who is to you? Who is he to you? Great uncle. Stand up so people can hear. Named after. Sure. And you're happy he's up here? Great. So everybody can hear, let me go through them with you. So there's his parents, his parents. He was born in 1893 in London, arrived in Britain January 1914. That means we're not exactly sure. He was killed in action in France and Flanders. He's commemorated at the Menin Gate, and here's some photographs of them. He was a member of the Jewish Lads Brigade, JLB, and here's a poppy remembrance of the JLB members. He was sent to Jewish school and so on. So he's one of the 500 plus fatalities of JLB that we're anxious to capture. Now, I don't want in any way to be rude, you would agree, I think, that the relative is not exactly a household name, not exactly somebody who is in your household name. That I didn't want to be rude. In your household, he's famous. But for all of us, he's not famous, and it's very important that he's not forgotten. Very important he's not lost. And I believe you brought some more material in tonight. Good. So, again, the next coming weeks, people will load that material on his personal record. So we should take Jasper. Okay, this is a guy I knew nothing about, to my shame, because he's buried not very far away from me. This is a man called Harry Jasby, who was in the Royal Flying Corps. Where's Tara? I need Tara. Where's Tara? Tara, stand up. The Royal Flying Corps, and he was killed in a Royal Flying Corps airdrome in Fairlop in Essex. It is the tradition, you can take over in a minute, it is the tradition, or was the tradition, may still be, I don't know, that in the Royal Flying Corps and the RAF, you get buried near to where you die. He died in a training accident in Fairlop Airdrome. And Tara found out an amazing story. Stand up, Tara. Tell us you want to come up to the microphone? Tell us the amazing story of this man.
Because he was buried in the nearest burial ground, it was a Christian church, and he was taken in there, and the local priest didn't have any idea what he was supposed to do to bury a Jew. He'd never had this sort of thing come up before. So he got into contact with the local synagogue and invited the rabbi over to come and show him how to do a burial, and also invite the local Jewish community to come as well, because his family were Canadian. None of his family were able to come, so the local Jewish community kind of took them under his wing and looked after him. And as a result of this, the two communities started speaking to each other for the first time, and they decided to create an interfaith group for their children, where their Sunday schools would come together, and every year they would go to his grave and they would put stones on top, and also do an arts project dedicating poetry and artwork to him, which they send off to his family who weren't able to be there every year, and they still do that till today. And this was the first kind of interfaith community of that kind ever to happen, and it happened because this young man brought everyone together, and it's still going on now, which is, I thought, lovely. And eventually they raised money and brought his family over in the 1980s, this community, and they held a massive service for him. So he's not been forgotten in that small community, but now he's not going to be forgotten by everyone because he's up here too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, here's a story which I think is particularly heartwarming. I didn't know about it, to my shame, because the church is... I've probably driven past the church a couple of thousand times. Had no idea. And it's a story which, again, is a story of an ordinary guy killed in an accident, training accident, but left a legacy which I think is very important. Tara, by the way, is from Leeds University, and is a student at Leeds University, and she's with us as one of our history interns, digging up these kind of stories. And if she arrives in your house to help you with your story, make sure that there's an escape thing, because she doesn't let you go unless she's got the story. She's very tenacious. Okay, so that's an example. Let's take one more. Yes, let's finish with the last one, because I don't want to take your time up. This one is particularly poignant. Okay. Who's ever heard of Robert Barnett? Not a very Jewish name. Well, that's because his real name is Raphael Glitzenstein. And he is actually very famous. Did you know that the first British Allied fatality of the First World War was a 15-year-old Jewish boy from Stoke Newington? In the summer of 1914, there was a family row. He had a row with his parents. He walked out. There was no conscription until 1916. Some unscrupulous recruiting sergeant saw this big lad appear on the doorstep and signed him up. This was in September 1914. He was dead by the December, age 15. Can you imagine? Can you imagine what went on in that household? Can you imagine? So we commemorate this boy. Here you are. Born 25th of June 1899 in Mare Street, Hackney. Killed 19th of December 1914. The Polk Street Wood, in Germans known as Birdcage. He's buried in the Rifle House Cemetery, Ypres. There's his stone. He's been kept company by another Jew, which is kind of nice. I hope somebody a bit older. So there's two Jewish stones within the same photograph, which for us is quite rare. So this is the story, so young. This is the Commonwealth Graves Commission, where he's buried, age 15. Age 15. So who would have thought that the youngest fatality on the Allied side in the First War was a boy from Stoke Newington who ran away from home? So again, I repeat myself, you can imagine the educational value of that story, never mind the poignancy, never mind the human element, you can imagine the educational value when we work with Jewish schools. So ladies and gentlemen, that's all I want to say. Excepting the doors are still locked and will be unlocked when you volunteer a story. I'm only kidding. If you don't have a story, that's fine. You're most welcome. There are tea and cakes. You're most welcome. But if you do have a story, it really is incumbent upon you to tell it. Because if you don't tell it, it's going to get lost. If it's going to get lost, that is terrible. So my colleagues and I will be very glad to meet you afterwards, take your details. We'll not spend a lot of time with you this evening, but we'll contact you. There's the Yontif coming up for Christmas. But after that, we'll be in contact with you and we'll come and see you with scanning technology and with everything else. And we invite your help. Thank you very much indeed. Any questions? No? Good. Excellent. Yes. Yes. Right. Okay. Right. So if you know a name, that's 60% of what we need. Because there are records. There are public records. There are not public records. There's an investigative job to be done, and we know how to do it. So if you know a name, hopefully quite accurate, but even if it's, because lots of names are problematic, who knew who Robert Barnett's name was? But if you know a name, that's enough for us to get going. So please make contact with us afterwards. Okay? Yes?
Is there a means of search facility you can type somebody's name in?
Yes. Shall we show you the search facility? Right. One of the things we did, in 1922, the chief chaplain, originally the only chaplain to the military, was called Reverend Michael Adler, and he undertook a massive job, and that was to create the Jewish Book of Honor. For all its problems, for all its omissions, for all its idiosyncrasies, it was an amazing human achievement, and he deserves credit for many things, but certainly our eternal gratitude for doing that. We, as part of the project, for the first time, digitized this book, about 600 to 700 pages. It really did give the software house heart failure. It really did give the scanning company in Southampton the collywobbles. But nevertheless, we persevered and we did it in the Heritage Lottery. We're immensely grateful to it. This is the British Jewellery Book of Honour, now digitized. So, would you like to give us a name? Don't say Cone. What? If you say Cone, we'll be here all night. So, do you have a name of somebody? Go on. S-I, did he die or survive? You don't know. S-I-N-T. Do you know anything else? N for Norman. Sugar, India, Norman. Right, Sint. Well, what have we got? Not under this name. Any other names? You don't know. Okay, so we still have to do some more searching. Any other names? Sorry? Jacobs. Jacobs. How much time have you got? What? Sorry? Meyer. Meyer, okay, let's try Meyer. Right, there's all the Meyers. REF. He didn't die, according to this. He survived. None of them died. Great. Great. Perfect. So you'll be telling us in a minute what the story. Perfect. Don't let that lady out of the room. Louise, don't let that lady out. You're sitting beside her. Tara, rugby tackle that lady. Okay. So, a suggestion, David? Yeah. The current population? Yeah. The current population of East End for us is through the secondary schools. So we've been working, for example, with Walworth Academy, which is a bit of South London, but also South East London, and we were doing programs with them. We're doing programs with Parmenter School, which is a big non-Jewish school, secondary school in the city. We started to work with the JFS and their World War I records. We need to talk to you about that. And so we started in relation to schools in the East End as an example of who lived in the East End where you are now living. Where the Somalis or the Bangladeshis are now living, this is where the Jews lived, and before them, somebody else lived. So we are doing that. Another name, and then did you say someone? Louis Victor, V-I-C. Oh, Flying Corps. Let's see if we can find him. One of these, the Royal Flying Corps? Okay. Anybody know somebody who died? Pampel. Okay, Pampel. Put in Pampel. We don't have time. Yeah. So here we are. We found Pampel. We know he's the King's Royal whatever. He lived in Gold Street. He lived in 11th King's Royal thing. Gold Street, London East. He died on 8th of August 1917. So the lady who asked only a name. So we can begin to look at this and other search engines for people. We can begin to look at people. We can find people, by the way, who did not die, but it takes longer. That's the reason we're glossing over it. There's no problem about doing that. But if you go onto the website yourselves, look up the Jewish Book of Honor, you can click on this and you can click on the search engine. You can go to the Commonwealth Graves Commission on this site. You can load in names, click on it, and it'll take you directly to anything the Commonwealth Graves Commission knows. It's a very powerful tool from the Commonwealth Graves Commission. Okay, anything else? Yes.
This one didn't do on the day last week. Our week was my great grandmother's flat was kicked by the second assault. She doesn't know the address, somewhere in East End. Her name was Betsy Barnett, née Elizabeth Lyons. Her parrot was killed, but she was out shopping.
So she lost her parrot. You know the parrot's there?
Yes. And I just
Perfect. Well, one will catch it. So there's an example of it would be great to find out about a story of a house which was destroyed not in the Blitz 40 years later, whatever, 30 years later, but by a Zeppelin. The Jewish book, the children's books from Liberal Synagogue have got drawings and paintings in the books of children describing the Zeppelin, Zeppelin raid. We came across a lady at an event whose family story is that her great aunt remembers the Zeppelins flying over and them dropping bombs over the side of the Zeppelin. We also met a gentleman who came up and said, I don't know anything about the First World War. Know nothing about the First World War, which is a great opening moment for us to say, right, we got you, what do you know? And of course, what happens? His family were famous cabinet makers. And they had a cabinet making workshop in the East End. The War Office came along, and as we say in Gaelic, chapped this factory and made it over to making newfangled things called propellers for this thing called the Royal Flying Corps. And he has a propeller in his garage. To which we said, don't you think that's mildly interesting? Nobody else has got a First World War propeller in their garage apart from the RAF in Hendon. So all these things are going on. They're just going on. It's amazing what's going on out there. We've got to capture these stories. Anything else? We'll get your story before the evening's out, including we'll try and find the name of the parrot.
You mentioned Paris. My late grandfather told me his brother made him sticks.
Ah!
I've no idea who he was,
Right.
or where he made them, but that's what he used to do. And I remember my late grandfather had a whole collection of cookie sticks.
Made from propellers.
First one.
Fantastic. We'll get that story. Don't leave the room. Every time you say these things, it means you can't leave the room. Anything else?
National Heritage Shopping Fund like to see nice big buildings making their money. What did they do when you came back with their website?
Okay. They were both suspicious because they like buildings. If you come along, if the Jewish community comes along with a mikveh, then that's perfect as far as they're concerned, particularly an ancient mikveh. When you come along and say, we want to tell the story and we want to do it via a website, they have an attack of collywobbles. But they persevered with us. It was difficult because they were 5 years ago, new to digital history. It wasn't something they were at all familiar with, and indeed the guidelines they wrote on how to do it were near useless. We probably helped them rewrite the guidelines. This project is now regarded as one of the top 10 digital history projects of the Heritage Lottery Fund, which is great for the Jewish community. Partly it's great because our next objective is to go outside London and go nationally. The Jewish communities of Manchester, of Liverpool, of Hull, where there were great communities, Grimsby, where there were great communities then, not so much now. And they're considering that application as I stand here. I hope we're successful because we don't want to lose their stories otherwise. And that's because we're able to demonstrate that there are stories to be told. The contribution that you're making evidenced that there were great Jewish stories at risk of being lost, and that there are stories of the First World War period, what we call these history windows, which are also at risk of being lost. The collections, this gentleman with a book before, that in heritage terms justifies everything, that we can preserve a book of photographs. I don't know, there's perhaps 40 pages with perhaps 6 photographs per page. So we can look after 250 photographs of the First World War and make them available digitally. That in itself justifies it. So I think the Jewish community is well on its way to demonstrating that we were there too in a very substantial way. Thank you very much. There's tea and coffee available.